Jamal Carter was a bright 17-year-old high school senior known for his academic achievements and passion for basketball. He had big dreams of attending college on a scholarship and building a future for himself in a town where opportunities were scarce. But that all changed one fateful night when he was wrongfully accused of a brutal crime that shattered the peace of the community. The police arrived at his doorstep early in the morning after the incident, and Jamal found himself thrust into a nightmare he couldn't escape. The accusation was absurd. He had been at a school basketball game at the time of the crime, surrounded by teammates and coaches, but despite the alibi, the officers were insistent Jamal was the one they were looking for. He tried to explain the situation, but his voice was drowned out by their claims of evidence that didn't exist. His reputation as a quiet black teenager from a low-income family made him an easy target for blame. As he sat in the cold holding cell of the local police station, he couldn't believe what was happening. His mind raced, trying to understand how everything could turn against him. In an instant, his family was devastated. His mother fought tirelessly to gather resources for his defense, while his father struggled to contain his anger against a system that seemed determined to ruin his son's life. Jamal's defense attorney was a weary man who seemed to be drowning in cases just like this one, but he promised Jamal's family he would do his best to fight the charges with everything he had. The trial was set just weeks after Jamal's arrest, and from the very beginning it was clear that something was off. The judge assigned to the case was Robert Sinclair, a man known throughout the town for his conservative views and bias against the black community. Sinclair had always maintained a reputation for being tough but fair, but many knew his views on race colored his decisions. Even if he never openly admitted it, it didn't take long for Jamal to realize that Sinclair was no friend to him. He could see the way the judge looked at him during the proceedings with disdain and suspicion. His every word and action in the courtroom seemed to make it clear that Jamal's fate had already been sealed. Despite the lack of any real evidence against Jamal, the trial moved forward with frightening speed. Witnesses who could vouch for Jamal's whereabouts on the night of the crime were ignored or dismissed. The prosecution leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence and vague accusations that seemed to target Jamal simply because of his race. The jury sat quietly as the prosecutor painted Jamal as a criminal, while Sinclair offered little in the way of objection to the biased arguments. His heart sank as he realized that no one in the room cared to look beyond the surface. They didn't want to hear about the teenager who loved to read, or the one who had dreams bigger than the town could offer them. Instead, they only saw a black boy from a poor neighborhood, someone who didn't belong in the same room as the people making decisions about his life. Jamal could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. Every word felt like it was another nail in his coffin. Even when his lawyer tried to make a compelling case for his innocence, Sinclair didn't budge. The judge's cold demeanor was like a constant reminder that this trial was never about the truth. It was about something far darker, something Jamal couldn't change or escape. No matter how hard he tried, his fate was sealed long before the jury rendered their decision. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Sinclair pronounced the verdict guilty, and Jamal felt the weight of the words crush him. His heart raced, and for a moment, the world seemed to blur around him. His mother's gasp echoed in the quiet, and his father's fists clenched in rage. Jamal's life had just been stolen from him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, signaling the end of the trial, but for Jamal, it felt like the beginning of something far worse. His world, once full of hope and promise, had been replaced by a cold, oppressive reality. The walk out of the courtroom was long and suffocating. Jamal's legs felt weak as he was escorted by officers, his handcuffs biting into his wrists. His mind was reeling, unable to grasp the full weight of what had just happened. He kept replaying the trial in his mind. The biased rulings, the way the evidence had been dismissed, the look of contempt on Sinclair's face. But none of it mattered. The system had already decided. Jamal was guilty, and now he had to pay the price. His family tried to fight it. His mother, eyes red and swollen from crying, spoke passionately to anyone who would listen, telling them that Jamal was innocent. They contacted every lawyer, every civil rights group they could find, but the wheels of justice moved slowly, and the prison door slammed shut in Jamal's face. The first night in prison was the worst. The stark walls, the cold air, the harsh sounds of shouting and metal doors slamming. Jamal felt as though he were trapped in a nightmare. He lay awake in his small cell, the reality of his situation sinking in deeper with every passing minute. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was stripped of his future. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Jamal found himself adjusting to the brutal rhythm of prison life. He learned quickly that survival depended on keeping his head down, staying out of trouble, and avoiding the constant violence that filled the air. The prison was filled with people who had been failed by the system, just like him, and Jamal began to feel the weight of their anger and despair. He had always been the hopeful, ambitious young man who dreamed of better days, but now, in this dark place, it was hard to hold on to that hope. His name became a symbol of the injustice that had been done to him, but it was a symbol that brought little comfort. Outside the prison walls, his mother's fight never stopped. She wrote letters, met with activists, and demanded answers. But the system that had sentenced her son was not easily swayed. The appeals process was slow and expensive, and every step forward felt like 2 steps back. Jamal's case became a rallying cry for those who believed in justice, but it also seemed like a lost cause to many. The weight of the world was on his family's shoulders, and Jamal's heart ached with the knowledge that he was the one who had put them through this. His parents had worked so hard to give him a chance at a better life, only for that dream to be ripped away by a corrupt system. In the prison yard, Jamal met others who shared his pain, men who had been caught in the same web of injustice. He became friends with some of them, their shared struggles forming a bond that was stronger than anything the prison could throw at them. But even in the company of others who understood, Jamal felt more isolated than ever. Every night, as he lay on his bunk staring up at the ceiling, he wondered if he would ever see the outside world again. Would anyone ever believe that he was innocent? Would his name ever be cleared? The questions haunted him, but the answers seemed forever out of reach. 5 years passed, and Jamal's life in prison became a cycle of routine and survival. Days blurred into one another, each one carrying the weight of his wrongful conviction. He had grown used to the relentless noise of the prison, shouts echoing down long corridors, the clanging of metal gates, the screams of men in their cells at night, but none of it had prepared him for the emotional toll. Over time, Jamal learned to lock away his anger, his sorrow, and his frustration deep within himself. He had to if he was ever going to make it through. Yet there were still nights when the isolation became too much, when he couldn't silence the thoughts racing in his head. Every few weeks his mother would visit him. She always arrived with hope in her eyes, though it had dimmed somewhat over the years. Jamal knew how hard it was for her, how each trip to the prison wore on her, but she never stopped fighting for him. She wrote letters, made calls, and worked tirelessly to gather the resources needed for an appeal. Yet the justice system had its claws deep into their lives, and each time they seemed to gain ground, they were pushed back. The appeal process was a labyrinth, and Jamal felt like he was at the center of it, spinning endlessly without any way out. But then, a glimmer of hope arrived. Eva Morris, a young civil rights attorney known for taking on cases of wrongful convictions, reached out to Jamal's family. She then heard about his case through an advocacy group she was involved with, and she was determined to help. Eva was driven by a fierce sense of justice, and she knew that Jamal's case was more than just a simple miscarriage of justice. It was emblematic of a broken system, one that needed to be confronted head-on. For the first time in years, Jamal felt something he hadn't in a long while: hope. Eva's involvement marked a turning point. She quickly began working to gather new evidence that could prove Jamal's innocence. She uncovered inconsistencies in the original investigation, traced witnesses who had been ignored or dismissed, and found new experts willing to testify that the evidence used to convict Jamal was flimsy at best. The case quickly gained attention from the public, and soon the media began to spotlight Jamal's plight. His story spread like wildfire, becoming a symbol of the systemic racism and corruption that tainted the justice system. For Jamal, it was overwhelming. On one hand, he was grateful to have someone fighting for him again, but on the other, the pressure mounted. After so many years of being told he was guilty, of being treated as though his life didn't matter, The idea that people were now rallying behind him was hard to fully accept. The prison walls had felt like his only reality for so long, and now suddenly there was the possibility that he might walk out of those gates a free man. But Jamal's journey was far from over. The legal system, stubborn and entrenched in its ways, was not about to give up its hold on him easily. As Eva dug deeper, she encountered fierce resistance from those who had once been involved in his case, including Judge Robert Sinclair, the man who had sentenced him in the first place. Sinclair, now under increasing scrutiny, attempted to defend his actions, claiming he had acted in good faith. But as the evidence against him piled up, it became clear that the case wasn't just about Jamal's innocence. It was about exposing a larger system of corruption that had allowed men like Sinclair to wield unchecked power. Jamal's story was no longer just his own. It had become a movement, a fight for justice that went beyond one individual's case. As the wheels of change slowly began to turn, Jamal was finally starting to feel a sense of agency again. Yet with every step forward, the question remained, would the truth be enough to set him free? Would he ever see the world outside those prison walls again? Only time would tell, but for the first time in years, Jamal dared to believe that freedom might be within reach. The momentum behind Jamal's case was gaining traction, and with it came the growing pressure on everyone involved, especially Judge Robert Sinclair. Eva Morris, relentless in her pursuit of justice, had spent the last few months compiling the new evidence that would unravel the original conviction. She had uncovered key witnesses who had been dismissed during the trial and experts who could now testify to the flaws in the case against Jamal. As the public's attention focused on the injustice, the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. The community that had once been divided over Jamal's guilt or innocence now stood largely united in outrage, demanding answers. But Sinclair, stubborn and determined to maintain his authority, was not willing to let go of his position so easily. As Jamal's case gained attention, Sinclair's past rulings came under scrutiny. It wasn't long before it became clear that he had built his career on a foundation of racial bias, dismissing or misjudging cases involving black defendants in favor of the prosecution. His history as a judge was now being exposed for what it truly was, a pattern of injustice that had been allowed to thrive unchecked for years. The investigation into Sinclair grew more intense, with reporters and activists digging into his past. The public began to question how many lives had been affected by his decisions. Sinclair's arrogance only deepened as the pressure mounted, and he continued to insist that Jamal's conviction had been just, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. His refusal to acknowledge his errors became a symbol of the larger problem at play, one that many believed had been festering in the justice system for far too long. Meanwhile, Jamal's life inside the prison walls had taken a significant turn. As his case made headlines, more people began to take notice of him. Fellow inmates, once indifferent to his story, now saw Jamal as a symbol of resistance. Some even began to support his cause, offering what little resources they could to help. Word of his case spread beyond the prison, reaching other inmates who had been wrongly convicted or who shared Jamal's pain and frustration. While Jamal still struggled with the emotional weight of his years behind bars, he felt the growing strength of the movement behind him. He wasn't alone anymore. Back outside, Eva's work was beginning to show results. With the mounting public pressure, the legal system was forced to respond. The state reopened Jamal's case, and Eva was determined to expose every flaw in the original investigation. As she dug deeper, it became clear that the initial trial had been a farce, a biased judgment from a judge who had already made up his mind. The case against Jamal was full of contradictions and falsehoods, and it became increasingly apparent that Sinclair had ignored crucial evidence that could have cleared Jamal's name. But as the pressure on Sinclair grew, so did his desperation. Behind closed doors, he began to make calls to his allies, trying to shore up support among those who could still protect him. The more he fought to maintain his position, the more corrupt and insecure he appeared. Emily Sinclair, his daughter, had begun to sense the shift in her father's demeanor. She had grown up idolizing him, but now, watching the public's disillusionment with him grow, she started to question everything she had ever believed. It was clear that her father's legacy was on the verge of destruction, but she was torn between loyalty to him and the overwhelming evidence that pointed to his wrongdoings. As the case against Sinclair grew stronger, Jamal's supporters began to gain momentum, calling for his release. There was no denying the mounting evidence, no denying the truth that had been hidden for so long. But Sinclair wasn't ready to back down. He had spent decades in power, and he wasn't going to lose it without a fight. The stakes were higher now, not just for Jamal, but for the entire community. This was no longer just about one man's freedom. It was about a system that had failed countless people, a system that had allowed corruption and prejudice to go unchecked for far too long. Jamal, for the first time in years, felt like the tide was turning. The world outside the prison walls was changing, and with every piece of new evidence, every protest, and every article written about his case, he could almost taste the freedom that had been stolen from him. But he knew that Sinclair wouldn't give up without a fight. The battle was far from over, and Jamal had no idea just how much more he would have to endure before the truth could finally come to light. The day Jamal Carter walked out of the prison gates felt surreal. After 5 long years of fighting against an unjust system, he was free. But freedom, as Jamal quickly learned, wasn't as simple as just walking out of the cell. The world had changed, but so had he. The boy who had entered those prison gates 5 years ago, full of hope and ambition, was now a man scarred by the brutality of a system that had nearly destroyed him. His mother was the first person to greet him. Tears filled her eyes as she pulled him into a tight embrace, her relief palpable. Jamal could feel her body trembling, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was a strange, heavy silence in the air. His family had fought so hard to bring him home, yet now, standing on the outside, he felt more like a stranger than ever. The world he once knew had shifted. His old friends had moved on, his high school classmates had graduated, and the dreams he had once harbored felt distant, as though they belonged to someone else. The media was there to capture the moment, the cameras flashing as Jamal emerged from the prison doors. Reporters swarmed around him, shouting questions about his time behind bars and the legal battle that had brought him to this point. But Jamal barely heard them. His mind was focused on the journey ahead. His mother was speaking to the reporters, telling them how grateful she was that her son was coming home. But Jamal could only think of how he would rebuild his life, how he would move forward after everything he had lost. The legal system had finally recognized the injustice that had been done to him. After a long battle, the evidence that Eva Morris had gathered had proven undeniable. Sinclair's corruption was exposed for the world to see, and Jamal's conviction was overturned. But that didn't erase the years Jamal had spent in prison, nor did it bring back the life he had lost. There were no simple answers, no quick fixes. He was free, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would stay with him forever. As Jamal settled into life outside, the adjustment was harder than he had imagined. The weight of the prison system still clung to him, a constant reminder of the cruelty he had faced. It wasn't just the flashbacks of the violence and isolation, but the deep-seated fear that he would never be able to escape the shadow of his conviction. Everywhere he went, there was the look in people's eyes, the suspicion, the uncertainty. Even though he was innocent, the world wasn't so quick to forget that he had been incarcerated for a crime he didn't commit. Jamal's old neighborhood felt foreign now. His friends had moved on with their lives, and the streets he had once known so well now seemed distant, as if they belonged to a past he could no longer touch. He tried to reconnect with the people he had once known, but it wasn't the same. His family, though supportive, had their own wounds to heal, and Jamal couldn't help but feel like he was a burden to them, like the man he had become wasn't the man they had once hoped he would be. The hardest part, though, was the shame that came with his freedom. Even though he was innocent, Jamal couldn't escape the feeling that he had been tainted by the system that had tried to break him. Every moment he spent in the outside world reminded him of the years he had lost, the years he would never get back. He tried to focus on rebuilding his life, but every step forward felt like an uphill battle. Meanwhile, Judge Sinclair was facing the consequences of his actions. As the investigation into his misconduct reached a boiling point, Sinclair's once untouchable position began to crumble. He was suspended from his judicial duties, and the state's Judicial Review Board began to probe into his long history of biased rulings. The public outcry against him was deafening, and soon the calls for his removal from the bench became impossible to ignore. Sinclair's once pristine reputation was in tatters, and his career was all but destroyed. Jamal's case had become a symbol of the flaws in the justice system, and his name was now being used as a rallying cry for reform. The pressure on Sinclair continued to mount, and eventually he was disbarred. The courtroom where Jamal's life had been destroyed would now serve as a monument to the fight for justice, a reminder that the truth could always be uncovered, no matter how deeply it was buried. But even as Sinclair faced the consequences of his actions, Jamal was left to confront his own. The public had given him their sympathy, but he knew that the real fight was just beginning. His journey was far from over. He had been freed from prison, but the struggle for true freedom, for justice, for healing, was a battle that would require more than just legal victories. It would take time, courage, and the unwavering support of those who had stood by him. And despite everything, Jamal knew that, with every step forward, he was reclaiming not just his freedom, but his life. Jamal Carter had always dreamed of a future filled with possibilities, college, a career, a life of freedom and purpose. But now, after everything he had endured, those dreams felt fragile, like a distant memory he wasn't sure he could ever truly reach. His return to the outside world wasn't the grand homecoming he had once imagined. The streets were no longer familiar, and the people who once surrounded him had changed or moved on. Jamal didn't know where he fit anymore. Despite his newfound freedom, a sense of isolation began to settle over him. The community that had once rallied behind him felt distant now, and Jamal found himself grappling with an internal battle he hadn't anticipated: how to find peace after years of injustice. His mother, who had fought so fiercely for his release, watched him struggle quietly. She tried to encourage him, urging him to take things one step at a time, but she could see the burden on his heart. No matter how much he wanted to move forward, the weight of his past wouldn't let him go. Jamal's first few months out of prison were filled with therapy sessions and long nights spent reflecting on his experience. He had been offered media interviews, public speaking opportunities, and a chance to become the face of criminal justice reform, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for any of it. Every time someone spoke about his story, as if it were a symbol of something greater, Jamal felt an overwhelming sense of discomfort. He wasn't just a symbol, he was a person who had lost years of his life, who had been forced to grow up behind bars in a place that had nearly stolen his soul. He wasn't sure he was ready to represent something bigger than himself when he was still trying to figure out who he was. His mother's words echoed in his head. Asterisk, take it one day at a time. Asterisk, but with each passing day, Jamal found himself asking how he could rebuild the life he had lost. His old dreams felt too far out of reach, and the anger that had been buried for so long began to rise to the surface. The injustice of his conviction, the years he had spent behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, kept haunting him. He had been told time and time again that he was innocent, but how could he accept that when the world had already treated him like a criminal? Jamal knew that he couldn't move forward until he dealt with the weight of his emotions. It wasn't just the legal battle or the public pressure. It was the trauma, the years of isolation, the constant fear. He had lost friends, and his family had been forced to bear the brunt of his wrongful conviction. The deep scars of the experience ran far beyond the time spent in a prison cell. They lingered in his relationships, his sense of self-worth, and in the way he now viewed the world. During his therapy sessions, Jamal began to confront the anger that had been building up for years. He talked about the loneliness, the fear, and the nights when he felt like he was losing his mind in the confines of a tiny prison cell. He spoke about the helplessness he felt when he knew he was innocent, but no one cared. Slowly, he started to let those emotions out. It wasn't easy. He often felt like he was unraveling, but it was necessary. While Jamal worked on its healing, he also began to find a way to move forward. Eve Morris, the attorney who had helped secure his release, remained a steadfast ally, encouraging him to find a way to use his story for change. She urged him to speak out about his experiences, not just as a way to heal, but as a tool for reform. Jamal was hesitant, unsure of whether he had the strength to do it. But over time, he realized that if his story could help others, if it could help prevent what had happened to him from happening to someone else, then maybe it was worth it. One day, after months of struggling with the decision, Jamal agreed to meet with a few criminal justice reform organizations that had reached out to him. He spoke with them about his case, about the flaws in the system that had led to his wrongful conviction, and about the lasting trauma of being unjustly imprisoned. His voice was shaky at first, but as he spoke, he began to feel something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. Maybe he couldn't change his past, but he could make sure that other innocent people didn't have to endure the same fate. As Jamal began to open up more publicly about his experience, something unexpected happened. The pieces of his life started to fall into place. He found a renewed sense of hope, not in the way things had been before, but in the way he could now shape the future. He became an advocate for those who had been wrongfully convicted, working alongside groups to raise awareness and push for policy changes. He found a sense of community in the people who had also been impacted by injustice, and with each person he helped, he began to rebuild the parts of himself that had been lost. Jamal's journey wasn't over, and there was still much work to be done. But for the first time in years, he began to feel like he had a purpose beyond survival. Through the pain, the anger, and the scars, Jamal Carter had begun to find his way forward. And though the past would always be a part of him, it no longer defined who he was becoming. Jamal's life had become a blend of reflection and action. He had found a new purpose in advocating for criminal justice reform, and though the road was long and filled with obstacles, he was determined to make a difference. Each day, he worked tirelessly to ensure that his story wasn't just a personal account of injustice, but a call to action for everyone affected by the broken system he had experienced firsthand. His public speaking engagements became an outlet for both his healing and his desire to help others who were still trapped behind bars for crimes they didn't commit. However, despite the progress he was making, the emotional toll remained heavy. Jamal hadn't fully reckoned with the pain of his past, and sometimes it felt like he was living in two worlds. On the one hand, he had a new sense of purpose and was helping others through his advocacy. On the other hand, he struggled with flashbacks and the lingering sense of anger that could still seize him without warning. The memories of his wrongful conviction, of his time in prison, still haunted him, but he had learned to manage them better with therapy and the support of those who cared about him. But there was one thing Jamal hadn't anticipated: the deepening rift between him and his family. His mother, who had stood by him through everything, was proud of his advocacy work, but as the months passed, Jamal began to sense a growing distance between them. She was still grappling with the trauma of the years spent fighting for his freedom, and Jamal understood that. But he couldn't ignore the distance that had begun to form between them, a distance he didn't know how to bridge. One evening, after a particularly draining interview, Jamal sat in his apartment, reflecting on the complexities of his life. His phone buzzed with a message from his mother. Asterisk, we need to talk. Asterisk, it was simple, but Jamal knew what it meant. She had always been his rock, and now it seemed like there was an unspoken divide between them. He couldn't afford to let that gap widen any further. The next day, Jamal made the drive to his mother's house. As he sat across from her at the kitchen table, he saw the exhaustion in her eyes. Her once bright, hopeful gaze had been replaced with the kind of weariness that comes from years of fighting, of never getting the peace you deserve. They sat in silence for a few moments before Jamal spoke. "Mom, I know we've been through a lot, but I feel like we've been growing apart." His mother sighed deeply, her face etched with sadness. "I know, Jamal. I'm proud of what you're doing. I really am. But I've watched you go through so much, and it hurts me to see you still carrying all this weight. I've been carrying my own too. I thought when you were released, when we were finally free, that things would be different. But now I see how much you're still hurting. I don't know how to help you." Jamal felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized how much of his pain had bled into his relationship with her. The trauma, the anger, the need for justice, it had consumed him so fully that he had neglected the very person who had never left his side. His mother had been a pillar for him, but in the process, he had neglected to offer the same support to her. "I'm sorry, Mom," Jamal said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been so focused on fighting for everyone else that I forgot to fight for us." His mother reached across the table and took his hand. "We're both fighting, Jamal. Just remember that you're not alone. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself." That moment was a turning point for Jamal. He realized that while his fight for justice was important, it wasn't just about the world outside. It was about healing the relationships in his life that had been affected by the years of trauma. His mother had given so much of herself to him, and now it was time for him to give back. From that day forward, Jamal worked to rebuild the emotional connection with his family, particularly his mother. He made time for them, not just as a son, but as a man who had learned how much he had relied on their support. He recognized that healing wasn't just about fighting for the wrongfully convicted, it was about facing the wounds within his own heart and those of the people he loved. But as Jamal healed, Sinclair's legacy continued to unravel. Despite his best efforts to cling to power, the truth about his corruption came crashing down. It was now public knowledge that his judicial career had been built on a foundation of prejudice, and his disgrace was complete. Emily Sinclair, his daughter, who had once idolized him, was left to reckon with the father she thought she knew. Her life had been irrevocably changed by the man she had once looked up to, and the truth about his actions had shattered her illusions. As Sinclair's fall from grace became public, Emily found herself facing an emotional reckoning of her own. The father she had defended for so long was now the symbol of everything that was wrong with the justice system. Emily knew that her family's name could never be the same again, but she also knew that she could no longer remain silent about the legacy of harm Sinclair had left behind. She had a choice to make: to stand with him in his final days or to stand with those who had been wronged by him. Jamal's path had brought him to a place of action, but Sinclair's downfall had led to an internal transformation for Emily. She was beginning to see that the fight for justice was not just about saving one person, but about changing the system as a whole. Months had passed since Jamal Carter had begun his healing journey, and while he was still haunted by the ghosts of his past, he was no longer consumed by them. His advocacy work had flourished, and his voice, once silenced by the injustice that had nearly destroyed him, had become a beacon for those still trapped within the broken system. Jamal's speeches, interviews, and public appearances were no longer about the anger he had once felt, but about the resilience he had found. He wasn't just advocating for the wrongfully convicted. He was fighting for systemic change, for an end to the racial prejudices that had led to his own wrongful conviction. Through his tireless work, Jamal had formed alliances with influential activists, lawyers, and policymakers who shared his vision for reform. He spent his days meeting with those who could help shift the conversation about criminal justice, pushing for the changes he knew were necessary. He'd often worked late into the night, drafting letters, writing op-eds, and strategizing with others who were committed to the cause. The weight of his past still lingered, but he was no longer fighting it alone. His newfound purpose had helped him reclaim the life he had once feared he had lost forever. Yet, even as Jamal's journey toward healing and justice was well underway, the repercussions of Judge Sinclair's actions continued to unfold. The once respected judge, now a pariah, was facing more than just a professional disgrace. He had been disbarred, his judicial career ended in shame, but the consequences were far deeper than that. The public outcry against him had sparked a national conversation about systemic racism, wrongful convictions, and the need for reform within the judiciary. Jamal's case had become the catalyst for a larger movement, one that sought not only to right the wrongs of the past, but to prevent such injustices from occurring in the future. Sinclair's downfall was a complicated matter for his family. Emily, once a staunch defender of her father, found herself at a crossroads. She had spent so much of her life believing in his righteousness, in the integrity of the justice he had administered, that the truth was almost impossible to bear. But as the revelations of his corruption and racial bias continued to surface, Emily realized that her silence was no longer an option. The man she had once admired had been complicit in a system that had destroyed lives, including Jamal's. She couldn't remain loyal to him in the face of that truth. As Sinclair's world crumbled, Emily began to speak out against him, acknowledging the harm he had caused and publicly distancing herself from his legacy. Her actions were seen as a rare, though not wholly unexpected, act of accountability within a family that had long protected its secrets. Emily's decision to speak out was not easy. She had lost her father, but more than that, she had lost her belief in the justice system she had once trusted implicitly. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but her courage in confronting the truth was a small but necessary step toward healing for herself and the many others who had suffered due to Sinclair's biased rulings. For Jamal, this shift was symbolic. He understood that his own fight was part of something much larger than just his release from prison. The battle he was waging was for the many others who had been unfairly convicted, for those who had lost their lives to a system that had failed them. His freedom had come at a high cost, but he refused to let it be in vain. He now stood as a voice for the voiceless, a symbol of the power of perseverance and truth. As the months turned to years, Jamal continued his work with a fierce determination that had become second nature to him. His efforts were not without obstacles. There were always those who resisted change, who defended the status quo, but Jamal had learned that true change rarely comes without resistance, and he was prepared for the long fight. The battles ahead would be challenging, but with each victory, no matter how small, Jamal knew that the system was slowly but surely being transformed. Jamal's legacy was still in the making. His story was no longer just about the innocence of one man wronged by the justice system, but about the collective power of those who were committed to exposing the truth and demanding justice. Sinclair's fall had been inevitable, but Jamal's rise was something that had been earned, step by step, day by day. In the end, the fight wasn't just about holding one man accountable. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what Jamal had. And as long as Jamal stood, he would continue to fight for a future where justice, fairness, and humanity triumphed over prejudice and corruption. He had found his purpose, and in doing so, had discovered the true meaning of freedom, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been wronged by the very system that was meant to protect them.